So we're just wrapping up talking about the wonders of the respiratory system. Remember, guys, the previous slide is the one that really shows us the long-term effects of the changes to training that we're really interested in. Because obviously we're trying to progress our athletes with time, and like anything else, each system has a limited amount of adaptability. Along with it also only has it needs to have certain amounts of stimuli in order to cause it to adapt. So as we get to be in better and better shape, we don't have to breathe as much at lower intensities, meaning at the same work rate because our body's more efficient with utilizing oxygen. And at maximal intensity, we might be able to actually breathe a little bit harder, bigger volume, and faster breaths. That's the frequency, simply because we're literally in better shape. All of our secondary respiratory muscles are more well trained. And, at rest and a lot of submax intensity, we're not going to really see any difference in our diffusion. It's going to be at that maximal intensity we're going to see a bit better. That's simply because we actually have better perfusion. Because remember, that upper third of the lung doesn't really have as good a blood flow to it until we get up into higher intensities. So our AvO2 difference, so literally how much oxygen we're able to extract, is going to improve because we typically are going to increase not just our capillaries, those muscles, but those muscles are going to be able to enhance their ability to remove oxygen. We're going to do a better job of vasodilating to those individual fibers that are going to be really important for aerobic performance. Now, our muscles themselves are going to shift more towards whatever type of training we're doing. So we're doing a lot of aerobic style training. We're going to see more of a shift in size in our type 1 muscle fibers. And if we're going to do a lot more anaerobic work, we're going to see more of a shift to, remember, the 2A fibers, not 2X. Those are going to disappear. Or they're going to convert over unless they happen to be purely just type 2. Now, our capillary number is going to increase. Remember, that's going to allow us to go ahead and be able to send more oxygen, more blood to those individual fibers, which in turn is going to allow us to pick up more oxygen, which in turn is going to help increase that VO2 max. And myoglobin, which is remember, the protein inside of muscle that's going to take oxygen from the bloodstream and deliver it to the mitochondria, that in turn is also going to increase. So we're going to have another way that we're going to enhance our aerobic capacity of the muscles. So now, just because you're doing cardio doesn't mean your type 2 fibers are going to disappear. If anything, remember, guys, the fibers we recruit are the ones that are going to have these changes. So if you exercise at a high enough intensity that you're using your type 2 fibers, you're going to be able to increase the capillary, the mitochondrial function, and otherwise of those type 2 fibers. But that does require you to use a modality that's going to be stressful enough to cause this. So we're going to find that if you increase the number of mitochondria, you're going to have a better ability to use aerobic performance. And it's going to really hinge a lot on literally the amount of work you're doing. So if you want to have a greater amount of mitochondria, you need to do more and more aerobic style work. Now, there are those rate limiting enzymes that are related to how well trained you are. Succinate dehydrogenase, that's SDH, and citrate synthase, CS is its abbreviation. Those are going to increase with with training, which in turn is going to allow the citric acid cycle, since that's where they are incorporated into, to run at a faster rate, which in turn is going to allow us to use more aerobic metabolism from both breaking down fats through beta oxidation and carbohydrates through, obviously, glycolysis. So you can see over a longer periods of training, you're going to have much higher amounts of the activity of the enzyme. And this is mostly due to increasing the number of said enzyme. Enzymes really can't function faster or slower in and of themselves. There's a little bit of signaling that might help with that, but the real key is just to increase their number. It's the equivalent of increasing the number of factories you have. The more factories you have, the more overall production you're going to have of any given unit. So, any questions there? All right, thanks, guys. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of high intensity interval training, HIIT training. This is a really effective way to get some basic effects from training as far as increasing a little bit of mitochondrial function in some of our enzymatic pathways. The key thing is whenever you're looking at the total amount of improvement, when you're really looking at mitochondria, you're going to typically have a greater effect from doing more typical endurance training, but in the acute, it can be useful. So things like CrossFit and otherwise are good modalities to get somebody in good overall shape, but there's a reason why super high level marathoners don't just do CrossFit and become incredible marathoners. They need to have more specificity. They need to do a greater amount of total training volume. Now, what's one of the potential drawbacks that you guys can think of doing high intensity interval training? Anybody? Yeah, it's a lot of stress. It's obviously super high intensity. So do you think using HIIT training is really good for an out of shape 7-year-old? Bingo. So it's a good way to get in a very rapid and effective workout, but it's not always going to be a great option for everyone. Now, what you have here, when we talk about mitochondrial enzyme cytochrome oxidase, that is going to be one that helps a little bit with signaling. So it's going to be important, but PGC1 alpha is the bigger one when we're talking about increasing mitochondrial biogenesis. Now, if we're doing higher intensity work where we're getting closer to that lactate threshold, we're going to be increasing that lactate threshold. So we're actually hitting it at a higher percentage of our VO2 max, which is a good thing because you can work at a higher intensity of your VO2 max without the accumulation of metabolic byproducts, which means you're gonna be able to do that for even longer and be much more comfortable. So notice, guys, we've got blood lactate levels for VO2 max, so percentage of it, and then for just total treadmill speed. And you can see as someone goes from the red untrained to the blue trained, we're seeing this shift to the right, which is a good thing because that in turn means we're not going to be inducing fatigue as rapidly. Now, that respiratory exchange ratio we talked about of essentially the amount of carbon dioxide you're giving off to the amount of oxygen you're taking in, that in turn is going to actually improve and both absolute and relative. So we're going to do a better job of just simply relying on fat and or aerobic carbohydrate more as its predominant fuel source than anaerobic glycolysis to keep ourselves essentially able to perform for longer periods of time. So our resting VO2 is probably not going to change too much because it's just to keep your body going when you rest. It might go down a little bit when you happen to be getting effectively smaller. Now, it's when you're talking about exercising itself, as long as your body hasn't changed too much, it's probably not going to change at a given, speed or workload. The key is it might go down a little bit because you become more efficient with the movement. So if you're more efficient with the movement, you don't have to use as many calories or as much oxygen or to perform it. So you're going to be able to maintain an output much better. Now, the VO2 max is probably the best way that you're going to get an indicator of somebody's cardiorespiratory fitness. This is going to be able to increase a lot with training, and most of the increase is due to increases in cardiac output and that improvement in that capillary density, along with the local effects of being able to extract more oxygen thanks to myoglobin and increased mitochondrial number. So what we have here is a high-level aerobic athlete compared to someone that's going from being untrained to trained. And you can see the heart rates at rest, max, stroke volume at rest, at maximum, cardiac output at rest, at maximum, and so on and so forth. And as you'd suspect, the individual that happens to be in better condition, they can do a whole lot more. In fact, notice, guys, down here, that VO2 max is 81.9. That is one heck of an aerobic motor for a human being. Now, as far as long-term improvements from aerobic training, you're going to be able to get effectively, you're going to tap out someone's real potential to increase their VO2 max in really effectively only a year to a year and a half. Like, it's something that you can hit the relative peak of VO2 relatively quickly. However, we can still increase our performance because we're going to be able to increase that lactate threshold, increase our movement economy. So we're going to actually be able to race faster with time. Just your major changes are going to be made in the first year, year and a half of working with an athlete. And as you'd suspect, guys, back to one of our 5 different major principles, the individuality, it's going to hinge pretty heavily on how trained were you previous to the starting, what was that VO2 max, and then good old genetics. So you're going to find that as you increase the total amount of training volume, you're going to see an increase in VO2 max. But notice, guys, you don't keep seeing it increasing in that same initial performance increase. But that's why recruiting is going to be a big part. In fact, whenever we're talking about that training status and pre-training VO2 max, well, the more sedentary you are, the greater improvements we can hope to see. The more fit you are before you get into it, the less of an improvement you're probably going to see. And when it comes to genetics, notice, guys, from monozygous twins, meaning identical twins, dizygous twins, meaning fraternal twins, and then non-twin brothers, when you're looking at that VO2 max, everyone was pretty heavily related. And if anything, notice when it comes to the dizygous brothers, so fraternal twins, and the non-twin brothers, they seem to be about the same amount of distribution about the center line, meaning they've got the same numbers, whereas the monozygous is a little bit tighter. So like anything else, about a quarter to half of literally VO2 max performance is simply going to come down to who your parents were. Now, gender is going to also be a component in that, in general, an untrained male is going to have a higher VO2 max than an untrained female. When both are really highly trained, it's going to be much closer, but still statistically, males are going to be higher than females. And the responsiveness when it comes to genetics to how much you increase with training, it's going to be relatively tight. Now, it's important to understand everyone has genetics for what is their baseline, and then they have genetics for the total responsiveness. So high responders can make a lot more progress. Low responders don't make as much progress, and a lot of it comes down to genetics. So this graph on the bottom is actually showing you a variety of different females. So that dotted red line in the center happens to be effectively the initial VO2 level, and then the higher is going to be the far ends of the response. So you can see how certain families not only start with a much higher adaptability, but then from there can even make greater progress. And obviously, unfortunately, if you come from the other side of the gene pool when it comes to aerobic responsiveness, you're just simply not going to make as much progress. And the same is going to be found when you look at speed. Well, obviously, we've talked about fiber types being 50% heritable. And then when you're looking at a lot of other components of sport. So this is just giving you some ideas of those VO2 maxes, kind of like we discussed a little bit in class, of the numbers you're expecting to see from individuals as far as, non-athletes, individuals in different types of sports, and the numbers you'd expect to see. Some of these I don't put a whole lot of stock in. These are older numbers, which may or may not be over or underestimating what you truly expect to see from these type of athletes. So one of the reasons why we're going to do this aerobic training is simply so we can avoid becoming fatigued. If we happen to be in better physical condition, we're going to be able to not just compete at a higher work rate, but we're going to be able to recover faster. So it turns out your endurance ability is of massive importance for endurance-based events. Now, obviously, when you think about cross-country running, that's straightforward, but then you think of sports like soccer, basketball, depending on the iteration, you've got a really big aerobic need. Now, when it comes to non-endurance-based sports, why do you think having a good aerobic motor is important? Why do you guys think that would be? You can go unmute yourself or you can throw it up in the chat. Yes. Now, Jalen, in what way do you think it's going to help with recovery time?
Like if you're lifting and you're tired, if your aerobic speed is faster, you can recover faster.
Absolutely. Now keep going. Don't stop. If you recover faster, what does that then mean?
I don't know. That's all I have.
Oh, come on, Jalen. You're smart. Let's work our way through it.
Better
Okay.
performance.
A, you'll be able to perform better because you'll be able to recover more completely between each attempt. But what else?
Your heart rate returns to normal faster.
Yeah, who cares about your heart rate? Think about the major advantage of having a better aerobic, faster recovery, hence due to that better aerobic system when it comes to just practicing any skill. Yeah, I mean, you're a little bit more efficient with aerobic metabolism, but how does that help? Not really. In all reality, actually, if you had poorer recovery, it actually causes a greater signal on the body.
The faster you recover, the quicker you can get back to doing what you were doing before.
Good. And then?
You're able to perform at the rate at which you were performing before, quicker.
True. What's the advantage there? Dig a little deeper, guys. You're right there. You're right on the cusp.
You have better endurance. Or
Potentially. Think of it along the lines of learning a skill, guys. If you're trying to learn a new skill, why does having a faster recovery, how does that help you with learning that skill?
able to focus.
Yeah, you can do more. Exactly, guys. If you are working with two separate athletes, one athlete has to recover after whatever skill you're trying to teach them. They need a full 5 minutes to be able to practice that skill again. Okay? How many reps of that skill can they do in 1 hour? Think about it. They need 5 minutes to recover. Is that really going to be, they can do 30 of them in an hour, 60 minutes? So how many times can they practice that skill? Bingo. Now, if you have an athlete that can do that skill once every minute, how many times do they get to practice that in an hour? So, who do you think is going to learn that skill faster? Because they're literally getting in 5 times as many reps in a given practice. The athlete that can do literally 5 times as much high quality practice is probably going to make a whole lot more progress than your athlete that could only do 1/5 of the work. Does that make sense to you guys? Now, what can you guys think of would be examples of sports where you have to be very careful about trying to maximize aerobic or cardiorespiratory endurance because of possible negative effects on athlete performance? What sport can you guys think of where you'd have to be careful? I'm not doing too much aerobic work. Catherine, you've been quiet. Throw out an idea for me. Okay. Braden, why would too much aerobic capacity, and same thing, Ian, why would, for both baseball and for shot put, why? Why would that be an issue? Good point. Burkhart. Give me
Me?
context. Yeah, you.
Okay, I didn't know you meant me.
So give me a sport that if we try to maximize cardiorespiratory performance, we can really risk decreasing performance.
This could be dumb, like swimming.
Why would being in better aerobic shape for swimming make you a worse swimmer?
Oh.
That's okay. Think about when you're doing a lot of aerobic style work, what else is naturally happening?
I don't know what you mean.
Think through the repercussions of doing a whole lot of work.
Okay.
And Jake, you just hit on it. Same thing, Trendon. If we're doing too much cardiorespiratory training, it can be really, really hard to maintain body weight, especially for bigger athletes, because they use a lot more calories when doing aerobic style work than a smaller athlete. So if you've got a lineman, if you try to do a whole lot of cardio with them, you might turn them into they might have a great work capacity, but if they only weigh 200 pounds, they're probably not going to be a good lineman for you. Absolutely true, Braden. One thing that's important to keep in mind, guys, with any sport, if there's ever an argument over how strength training isn't useful for it, you should then check to see if they do any drug testing for anabolics. Because if steroids don't convey any benefit, then they don't bother with drug testing. Last time I checked, nearly every single professional sport tests for drugs because they do, in fact, convey a benefit. But it's going to come down to more of that straight up, it's really hard to maintain body weight whenever you're doing a huge amount of aerobic training to really maximize it. And when I say maintain a body weight, I'm not referring to a quote unquote normal body weight. It's easy to do relatively, good volumes of aerobic work and have a normal to overweight BMI. But it is hard to do a lot of aerobic style work and have a legitimately obese BMI. There's a reason why you don't see individuals that are really good at aerobic work look like, let's just say they're just typically not a very large person. Does that make sense to you guys? So now let's talk about the anaerobic. Now, we're going to increase both our peak power that we're going to be able to produce and how long we're going to be able to maintain that power anaerobically. Now, the wind gate, you guys can see the video online, it's miserable, but it's a pretty good indicator of your power output over those 30 seconds. So with training, we're going to increase your peak power and we're going to increase your ability to maintain that power output. This is mostly occurring in just our type 2A fibers. Remember, our type 2X, unless they're pure 2X, they're going to convert over to the 2As, and the cross-sectional area quite possibly is going to increase in size. Now, we can also have an increase in our type 1 muscle fibers, but this is not going to be as much. And overall, our percentage of type 2 fibers is going to increase. Now, you're not going to see a whole lot of change in your ATP PCR system. If you're supplementing with creatine, you're going to increase your creatine stores, along with if you might see a little bit of increase in creatine kinase levels, but nothing too crazy. The key is glycolysis. We're really going to be increasing those major limiting enzymes. So our essential hexokinase, phosphofructose kinase, so step 1 and 3 of glycolysis, and then lactate dehydrogenase, all of those are going to actually increase in number. And most of our changes are actually going to come due to increases in strength, which remember is also very much so neurological, with increasing rate coding, increasing synchronization. So over time, you're going to see increase in the total amounts of enzymes. So this is creatine kinase and myokinase, thanks to doing a lot of high intensity training, whether we're looking at the 3 or more into the 6-second range, which we're going to see the greater amount. So mean power output, how much is being able to maintain over a longer period of time. Now, a very important thing to keep in mind when we're doing any style of aerobic training, which is specificity. So we want to be as specific as we can be with our testing, but also sorry, I will answer your question in just a moment there, Tyler. So you're going to find that everyone is going to be better when it comes to VO2 max at the actual event that they train the most than they are going to be at something, in this example, of uphill treadmill running. Not a lot of people are just running uphill on treadmills recreationally. In this example, you've got athletes that are rowing, cycling, and skiing. And you can see how in one example, the athlete that was a rower has a VO2 max of close to 75, but when he performed their treadmill test, he wasn't even over 65. We're talking about a greater than 10% loss of VO2 max simply because, remember, we have those adaptations specifically to the muscles we're going to activate and the fibers within those muscles we're going to activate when we are doing those activities. So it can be very useful to go ahead and obviously do some cross training. So not exactly always doing the exact same sport specific moment all the time. If anything, you want to make sure that you're giving your body more variability. It tends to give you a lower risk of injury. So this is not just constantly trying to push performance in only one area, but instead make sure that you're focusing on a variety of athletic performance, especially in kids. Early specialization just massively increases injury risk and decreases your risk of actually making it in a real sport. Outside of effectively, the last time I really checked in on it, 4 different sports you have to specialize in early: gymnastics, wrestling, diving, and figure skating. Now, one thing to keep in mind is aerobic work will in fact blunt your training responses from strength training. However, we're talking about only getting 80% of the total amount of progress from your strength training if you wouldn't have done any aerobic work with it. So it's not like you waste your gains as much as a lot of people would like to fearmonger and tell you otherwise. In fact, there's certain studies where it's even less than that. And at the same time, your endurance performance is not going to be impeded by your strength training. So giving strength training to an aerobic athlete is not going to negatively affect their performance unless you do something incredibly stupid with your programming. And if you add some cardiovascular components to the training of an athlete that happens to be a aerobic athlete, or sorry, happens to be a strength athlete, they might not make as much progress as quickly, but they're still going to be making considerable progress over time. So good question from Tyler, and this is actually something that did do the rounds a little bit last year, which is creatine supplementation causing your hair to fall out. Yeah, that's wrong. That's not something you should be really worried about. I do find that to be pretty hilarious. I think I know what reference you're referring to there, and it's nothing that your average person needs to really worry about whatsoever, because creatine's in red meat, mind you, nowhere near as much as just supplementing with pure creatine, but your body naturally also produces creatine. And so unfortunately, thanks to genetics, guys, and the reason I say guys, it actually is, in this case, it's gendered more towards males, you can let you know whether or not your hair is going to leave you. Blame your mom and blame your dad, because that's where your risks for baldness really comes in. I know at some point I'm going to be rocking the horseshoe, but it tends to not really fully kick in until you're older in my family. So, good question. Doesn't make it any less discouraging when you realize that your hairline might be marching. So, what we have here is going to be different enzymatic levels. Okay, so activity is the way that they're going to be able to actually measure it, but it's truly going to be more about the number and how you're going to see differences for people that are anaerobically and aerobically trained. So notice SDH is in the citric acid cycle, hence why no real difference for anaerobic athletes, but massive for aerobic. Malate dehydrogenase, same type situation. Carnitine, palmitoyl transferase, that's going to get fatty acids into your cells, same type situation. But then when we go to our anaerobic enzymes, notice how much higher their CK and myokinase levels are. Myokinase is the one that's going to convert two ADPs into an ATP and an AMP. And then when we go to glycolysis, going to be a little bit higher with the phosphorylase, but look at PFK and especially at that lactate dehydrogenase and how those numbers are going to be much higher. So our long-term improvements from metabolic training, you're really talking about maxing out that VO2 in a year to year and a half. You're still getting improvements in lactate, essentially removal and movement economy well past then, so you can still increase your performance, but your massive and your fastest gains are going to occur relatively quickly. And these are going to be always heavily influenced by how well trained you were previous and genetics. Any questions about the long-term adaptations to doing anaerobic style training or aerobic style training? All right, so now we're going to go ahead and have you guys work in groups for a few moments, okay? The goal here is to give a basic training program for aerobic development, think specificity, for offensive linemen, heavyweight wrestler, and then a heavyweight Olympic lifter. So here's the thing. If you immediately say you're going to have them run 3 miles a day to do that, nope, not happening. If you're going to have them go ahead and swim, nah, probably not. That's not a whole lot of specificity what they're doing. But what can you give them as far as programming that's going to help develop their aerobic capacities, but not eat away at their muscle mass and their overall performance? So I want you guys to take your time, think your way through it. We're going to give you guys about, we'll say 5 to 10 minutes, but you should be able to give us the basic mode of training, essentially a basic rating of difficulty, and then how you would progress it. Any questions before we randomize you guys into 3 separate groups? All right, guys. So go ahead and have yourself some fun. I'll see you guys. We'll give you guys, plan on being back here at about 2:10. Okay. Think about the actions they're going to do in the sport and how you can help develop those metabolically. Good luck. So, yeah, but yeah, group 1, I like what you guys put in there. I would suggest that shortening up those distances and increasing the load, and then also increasing the total volume, because you figure for an offensive lineman, they're probably going to take more than 8 total snaps over the course of the game. You probably want to talk about doing more like 20. And if anything, you probably want to have the distance be only like 5 to 10 yards with a heavier load, but then doing shorter, rest periods. So you're keeping that heart rate elevated. So you are getting those aerobic adaptations in the heart, and then also those muscle fibers done in the actual movements. So that's good. That's good. I like that. Nice.
That was kind of my fault with the reps and everything. So I figured with like aerobic, the more yards we would do, but I got you now.
Yeah, no, I mean, you could start off with a lower load and just have them just do heavy sled dragging, like aerobically. You just go and just figure you're going to walk with it, and or sled push, almost like old school Conan's Wheel of Pain type deal. But I think for a little bit more of that specificity, you're probably going to be looking better there. And then obviously that bike example that you and I got to experience, that can be a really good way to also mimic those metabolic demands. So group 2 and 3, where are you guys at? Nice. Rowing machine's not a bad idea. You could also have them do some type of circuit style training where it could involve like a rowing machine, could involve some type of total body movement like a Airdyne bike, or one of those, the wonderful bikes you have to push and pull with your arms and also with your legs. Maybe like an arm over arm pull of dragging a sled towards themselves. Then you can even see things like people utilizing battle ropes and just kind of going from each of those stations and aiming to keep the heart rate elevated, because obviously the idea of doing that much wrestling as a heavyweight, that's going to be nearly impossible. But I like that. Last but not least, okay. There's nothing wrong with going with the lower percentages and then doing the higher reps. Now, one thing you could do, and this is based off of some stuff from, John Smith, and he tries to make himself, James Smith, the thinker. But I do like the idea of what you would take as the lighter load, and instead you would have them do a bunch of sets of singles and doubles on a very relatively short rest period. So they would do, effectively, they have a bar set with only, 50, 60% of their squat max, and then another bar set with 50 to 60% of their military press, and another bar set with 50% of their deadlift or snatch pull, clean pull, whichever movement you want. And they would just work those in a circuit. So they would do 1, 1, 1, back to the first station, 1, 1, 1, and keep going in a way. So you're getting that aerobic adaptation to those muscles they're actually utilizing relatively specifically without really interfering with technique. And you're not going heavy enough with load where you're really putting a lot of damage on the body, but you are recruiting the musculature in ways that it's going to be utilized. Great work, guys. Nice. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Remember, it's the spirometry lab for Friday, so come by the lab at some point, blow into the spirometer, get your numbers written down, and then we will talk through everything we saw whenever we see you guys on Friday. If nobody's got anything else, that's it. Have yourselves a great day. Stay safe out there, guys, and I will talk with you more soon. Well, no one's saying anything and people are leaving. So bye-bye, guys.